Welcome everybody to another episode of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance Podcast. I'm Mario, and today we have Dr. Casey Patnode as our co-host. Casey, do you mind presenting yourself?
Hi everyone, I am Dr. Casey Patnode. I'm currently in my R2 year of psychiatry residency at the University of Washington. I completed the first 2 years of my training in emergency medicine at the Harvard-affiliated emergency medicine residency before changing specialties to psychiatry. I completed medical school at the University of Michigan, where I also completed a Master of Public Health and Environmental Health Sciences. I am passionate about the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, and human health, and leveraging public health policy to help allow everyone the opportunity to lead healthy lives. And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Stephen Sugden, who's an associate clinical professor at the University of Utah's Huntsman Mental Health Institute. Dr. Sugden brings a wealth of experience in addiction medicine, lifestyle medicine, disaster psychiatry, and military and veteran mental health. He earned his medical degree from the University of Utah School of Medicine. He completed his psychiatry residency at UC Davis. He holds both a Master of Public Health from UC Berkeley and a Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. In addition to his academic and clinical work, he serves as a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserves. We're very excited to explore his insights on the connections between addiction, mental health, and climate change today. So just as an icebreaker here, I'd love to hear what song or album just puts you in a good mood consistently.
I grew up watching Star Wars, and I love the theme music. I mean, the soundtracks for the original soundtrack movies. And so it's like whenever I have to like really buckle down and get focusing, that's always been my go-to music of just kind of like, it's time to like buckle down and let's get to work done. Apart from that, I also grew up in the 80s. I love U2, and most of their music, can put a smile on my face.
Those are phenomenal answers. I love the soundtrack. I'm a big soundtrack while working person as well, so I love hearing that.
What soundtrack do you like?
Well, I'm a big fan of anime, so you can't go wrong with like a good old Naruto soundtrack, getting pumped and busting through some work.
Oh, wow, I wasn't expecting the anime answer. That's awesome to hear. All right, so let's dive into the heart of today's conversation. Dr. Sugden, what drew you to explore this unique combination of mental health, addiction medicine, and climate health?
So, we were just talking kind of for both of you, kind of like where you're early in your career. I graduated from medical school back in 2002, and psychiatry wasn't as developed or a lot of the times people weren't thinking about all of the different possibilities that could be within psychiatry. I can remember I did research as an undergraduate on the development of glutamate receptors within auditory neurons. And I really liked brain tracks, and I really liked the development of receptors and kind of how that whole network worked. And when I was talking to my dean at the time, my dean was saying, well, it sounds like you would like neurology better. And it's like, but I like the mental health. I like this aspect of mental health. And it's like, oh, but there's no career in psychiatry. You should be a neurologist instead. And over these kind of 20 plus years, there's really been a lot of change or a lot of growth within psychiatry and within the various options that we had. And so one of my first passions I found when I was a resident at UC Davis, we had some moonlighting opportunities. I was supporting my family. I had 3 kids at the time, and there was a moonlighting gig to be able to be kind of an assistant medical director for a chemical detox facility. And I'm a second year, and at the time you're attracted because it pays well. And at that time, my residency really didn't have a lot on substance use, and I think we went to a methadone clinic for 2 weeks, and that was the exposure we had as was our substance use. And I just found I was compelled by that population and working with that. And I think one of the things that really compelled me is that it was such a population that had been overlooked so many times And if one could just present and just try to be real with people and try to have a real human experience, how much more that was appreciated and how much more that seemed to help the people make those changes. And so that was what drew me into addiction medicine. I did my freshman year of college in New York City, and, I graduated in 2002. And so when 9/11 happened, that was hard. I can remember just thinking, it's like, I had been in a lot of those places in New York, and it seemed like an appropriate thing to join the military. And so upon residency, I joined the United States Army in what was kind of like what they call is the STRAP program. And it gave me a stipend during residency. And then I just owed them time afterwards. And so one of the things that being a psychiatrist in the Army, we started worrying about disasters and kind of, many times they look at this as like war-related disasters. And I really got fascinated by this, kind of like the aspects of the biological chemical warfare and what was that stress that would put on soldiers if they knew they were going to go into that type of an environment. And from that, I started really getting involved with disaster psychiatry. And, hence that was kind of led me to pursue one of the board specializations that I have. And everybody says, well, disaster is something that you can't prepare for, but it seems like we're on the verge of really having a huge disaster, which is, the changes in climate. And that might be something that we can actually try to predict that when that might happen and looking at that. And that's what's drawn me into climate health and just really the importance of that's something that we hopefully could make interventions now. We don't have to wait until we're kind of like one of those apocalyptical doomsday movie, Blade Runner type of environment and try to
Right.
then try to save the environment. Maybe we can make those changes now.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Sugden, thank you for sharing your amazing journey with us. I agree. This is the time for making an intervention or at least try to do something about it. And I'm curious, when you think about addiction medicine in the context of climate change, what stands out to you as most interesting or important?
So it's for what people think may be completely two different realms. There was a study that I talk a lot about, which was a study that came out, I think it was 2022 or 23. And it came out of JAMA Psychiatry, where they looked at all of the emergency department visits within the United States from the year 2010 to 2019. And then they did a correlation with weather patterns. And they found that when there was that upper fourth quartile of heat and humidity, that they had a higher percentage or likelihood of developing or presenting to emergency departments with mental health illnesses. And within that bracket are substance use disorders that for whatever reason, when people are more distraught emotionally, which I think that the heat does, oftentimes they look for the escape, and substances so frequently are that escape for people when they are emotionally distraught. And so I think whenever you kind of upset people's natural environment, and for those who may not have the healthiest of coping skills, people kind of turn into what maybe isn't a healthy coping skill, but what they found to be as a functional coping skill, which it ends up being substance use.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it sort of ties into what you talk about in terms of the various models of addiction and the brain disease model sort of being when you get towards the longer term aspects of substance use disorders, kind of linking back to studies showing that when, at least in animal studies and looking at, lived experiences of people as well, even if somebody's maybe even in a remission phase of their illness, when they have that acute stressor, it makes them much more likely to return to use.
Exactly. And there was a review article that looks at the brain patterns or the brain chemistry when you're exposed to people that have extreme heat. And oftentimes, if you get the core brain temperature above that 39 to kind of like 30, almost that 40 degrees Celsius mark, it has a dumping of dopamine effect, almost as if there is sort of this intoxication-like an effect. And there's been some speculation that might be another one of the precipitating factors, at least with regards to heat, kind of like tying into why that might be a precipitating factor for substance use.
Interesting. And I wonder if that may be a common mechanism of sorts as it relates to what you discuss in terms of increased suicide risk, and some studies as well showing increased violence risk during periods of extreme heat.
Exactly. And then I think one of the main things that these studies didn't talk, but I think is very linked to that, is when you start dysregulating people's hypothalamus, one of the first things is you dysregulate people's sleep. And we know that when people have poor sleep, they have a higher propensity to be irritable, have more impulsive behaviors, tend to engage with, their eating patterns get off, and they tend to then use more substances in that, when they're not sleeping well. And so all of those factors play into it.
And just to give our listeners a bit of context for those who might not be familiar with the theoretical models of addiction, could you briefly walk us through what they are?
Yeah. So back in 1997, in an attempt to try to destigmatize a lot of the realms of the talk of addiction, there was a lot of proponents that really started putting forward to this idea of a brain disease model behind addiction, and that addiction was this chronic disease state. And when they started going through it, there's been some tremendous work through the NIDA, and dopamine has sort of been this target neurotransmitter. And the dopamine story becomes, very common. We talk about that. But really, dopamine is one of about 7 neurotransmitters that are all working in there. And there's opioids, there's GABAergic, there's glutamatergic, there's serotonergic, there's norepinephrine, there's all of these other receptors that are going on that interact and affect dopamine transmission. But we just kind of focus on dopamine because the story is just easier. And so the idea then is when people engage with substance use that you have higher dopamine release. And if you exceed a threshold, then your brain starts developing a sense of salience. And so salience then is when those dopamine levels go down, that then somebody starts having like a withdrawal type of effect. Then they engage in more behaviors to try to get more dopamine within the system. And the neuroinflammatory process occurs because the brain is trying to downregulate dopamine because excessive dopamine can be neurotoxic. But people get reliant upon these constant levels of dopamine or this constant kind of stimulation type of an effect, that then it becomes this circle or this pattern to try to quote unquote feed this dopamine loop. And that has been really one of the models that has been very prevalent within the addiction world. And, that makes sense for a lot of people, but doesn't hold is there are many people who experiment with substances, but then don't go on to anything beyond an experimentation. And so if the brain disease model was the true answer for everything, then everybody who had that exposure potentially could have that. And we know that not to be true, that only about 10% of people who have that initial experience with some type of substance go on to have a substance use disorder. That kind of leads to a second model, which they call as the learning theory model. And the learning theory model is based upon those primary learning behaviors. And so the first one is we have like an experimentation of it. The second one is reward based, which is based upon the Pavlovian dog experiments. That if I train myself to use substances, first is my experimentation, and then I realize that I like the effect, or the effect helps me escape from something, then I go back to using that substance as a means for an escape or for some type of a benefit. And then the third part of that is an aberrant learning, where you realize that if you don't have that substance in your system, that then you have a withdrawal symptom or a negative affect or a negative response. And so then you go back to keeping up that substance within your body because you've learned that the withdrawal effects are not good. And, one could then say that leads into the brain disease model. It could or couldn't. That's another model. And then kind of the initial classic model was that of more of a psychodynamic model. And the psychodynamic model says is that, oftentimes due to various reasons, whether it's childhood trauma or whether it's, various other types of things like that, that people feel that they are of a deficit and that they feel inferior, that they're unable to cope, that they're unable to have these things. And it's more due to this internal strife that they're feeling. And then somehow, they get exposed to the substances, and they feel that the substances then help them escape from this moral deficit that they have. And so those are primarily like the three models of what leads people to have substance use.
Thank you for that explanation. It makes me think about how the environment shapes these models, especially since you mentioned in your paper a lot of toxic exposures aren't things that the patient can control.
So just for the people who are listening, the paper that they're referring to is this past year, our APA president, Dr. Viswanathan, as part of his APA theme for the year, has chosen the improvement or using lifestyle as a means to improve both physical and mental health. He was able to authorize through the APA to have a task force that would be involved with creating a curriculum for the APA and in ways to try to help the American Psychiatric Association be more aware of lifestyle psychiatry or lifestyle principles. And the chairman of this committee was Dr. Gia Marlowe, and she selected me to be the sub-chairman of the aspect of risky exposure of substances is the way that the American College of Lifestyle adopts it. And in kind of discussing about it, we figured that there's more than just kind of substances that people should avoid to have a healthy life. And so we've expanded that criteria or that definition to be the avoidance of toxic exposures. And so as part of that, I was chairman of this portion of the avoidance of toxic exposures for the APA.
Well, thank you very much for that summary and description of providing some context for what we're discussing here. And I think it's very prudent to consider not necessarily just risky, quote unquote, exposures, but as you pointed out, holistically considering the toxic exposures that our patients and the population at large is exposed to, many of which they don't have the opportunity to avoid on their own volition. As you're discussing in the aforementioned paper, 99% of the population found to having exposure to air pollutions and some prenatal effects even. So before somebody's even born, experiencing some of these toxic exposures and events. So maybe it's prudent to discuss some of the specific exposures, when it comes to these toxic things that our patients and the population at large is exposed to, and how those connect to our changing climate. One of which naturally was going to be extreme heat events, with perhaps the defining feature of climate change being an overall warming climate. I can imagine some of our listeners in the developed world may be thinking, well, so what if it might be a little hotter outside? Why, I can just crank the AC up an extra couple of degrees. Would you mind addressing just, to get ahead of, to make sure that people are going to be tuned in fully, would you mind addressing why that may not be the solution that some people may think it might be?
So much time do I have?
Yeah, as much time as you like.
Okay. So, I know we kind of live in this new, interesting dynamic world where people are kind of getting frustrated or confused, or that it's almost like there's been a swing where it's almost become politically incorrect now to talk about climate. So let's talk about things we can measure. So if we look from about the 1980s going forward, the core or the overall heat index of the world has gradually been increasing. When we look at in the past 8 years alone, 6 of the past eight years have been the 6 hottest years on record of the greatest amount of heat. And so, that's just, I don't think you can argue the heat. Why do we have heat? We can argue that. But I think for the purpose of this, if we can just agree that we can all say it's been progressively hotter. The other things that we can hopefully agree upon is that those periods of heat are becoming longer. And if you live in a city, it's been shown that if there's more cement in your city, that you have a higher degree of exposure or heat intensity or a heat index than if there's more urban, and that those populations then are greater affected. How do we then treat heat? Well, Casey, you did mention, for many people, we can turn the AC, and that's nice. But, and unfortunately, if you look at our dear friends in the Los Angeles area of this year, with extreme heat, we also have a lot more of the drought conditions. And it doesn't take much to then, unfortunately get a fire event like we had in the Los Angeles timeframe here in 2025, where we had the Maui fires in 2023, where we had the Texas fires in 2024, where you had, all of the fires along the West Coast back in 2021, when you had all of the extreme fires within Canada, in 2023. And we can just go on and on about all of these extreme fires that have occurred due to increasing drought conditions. And, back to then the comment is like, well, it works really great if I have air conditioning, maybe I can escape from that. But we also know that there are plenty of people, our rates of chronic housing insufficiency is increasing. And by definition of having insufficiency, it's a larger portion that are not going to have air conditioning. We also know that the economy has been worse, that money doesn't go as far. And, even though it would be nice to say that everybody could be able to turn on their AC units, if people don't have money and they have to choose between food or AC, many people are choosing food and water versus their AC conditions. And so economics of just blasting the AC then it's almost pricing some people out. We're then starting to have other sequelae that are involved with this. One of the other sequelae that we've noticed that, I mentioned this heat index that has been going up. The surrounding water has also increased. And whether we call it the Gulf of Mexico or we call it the Gulf of America, that body of water has also been increasing, the heat waves. And you look at the years where the water has been the warmest, 2017, 2021, 2024. And what happened in 2017? Well, that's when we had hurricanes Irma, Harvey, and Maria. 2021, that's when we had Hurricane Ian. 2024, we know about the hurricanes that have swept the North Carolinas this past year. And it's when the water is warmer, you're also set up for higher hurricane conditions. And again, no amount of air conditioning is going to prevent a hurricane from occurring, unless there's some type of new math science that I don't know about. So I don't know if that answered your question, Casey.
Oh, absolutely, it did. I really appreciate that. And I think to your point, as we're talking about folks who are struggling in terms of the economics of how they're going to keep themselves afloat in many ways, I do think we'd be remiss to not mention, I sort of framed this from a developed country perspective where folks can often take AC almost as for granted. But when we look worldwide, we're going to see many populations that don't even have the opportunity to have air conditioning regardless. And those are often the folks who are experiencing the worst effects of our changing climate. In addition to, as you're talking about the urban heat island effect, sort of connecting that furthermore to studies demonstrating that in most, if not all cities throughout the country, the hottest areas, the areas that experienced the most of that urban heat island effect were redlined historically. So another population that's been systematically disenfranchised and continuing to experience the worst effects of climate change. And furthermore, this sort of being a self-serving question of sorts, I guess, when it comes to air conditioning sort of being maybe a short-term solution, long-term problem for many folks, as it's a very energy-intensive thing to perform. Frequently based on our current power grid, that's going to result in further emission of gases that are going to have a greenhouse trapping effect and can potentially even worsen our problem in the long term. So certainly, I appreciate the answer to that question.
Well, and can I go off? Can I?
Please.
So I went to a conference and I had the opportunity a couple of years to attend some climate medicine workshops out of the University of Colorado. And I had a jacket that I was wearing that I had received from the University of Colorado that said climate medicine on it. And I had a conversation with an individual and, we were talking about these raises of temperature. And this individual said, oh, well, it's not because of A, B, C, and D. It's because there's been an increase of underwater volcanoes that have been having that and increasing, that exposure of heat entrapment from volcanoes. And I bit my lip. I did look from about 1980 to about 2020. I think there was like 7 that they had counted for. But something that there's a masterful book, it's called Fire Weather, and where it chronicles the fire of the Fort McMurray fires up in Canada back from 2016. And the author is just phenomenal that he just kind of goes through the science of fires. And that fire alone produced enough ash, the equivalent of 3 volcanoes, that it kind of put into the atmosphere. And we might not be having more volcanoes, but all of these fires are essentially putting enough ash into the atmosphere as these volcanoes would be, that instead of having volcanoes being the source of all of this increased temperature, it almost seems like it's the fires that are that aggravation, which may also be contributing to the increasing temperature or that increasing carbon in the air that could be resulting in more of the greenhouse gases. And I think that could also explain why we've been seeing such an increased trend over these past 8 years.
Well, that's really interesting. I haven't thought about that. And since we're still talking about heat, I wanted to bring up something you mentioned. I think it was in another conversation and also in your paper about how rising temperatures and pollution can actually lower the nutritional value of food. I think we discussed crops, and then when people rely more on processed food, especially in excess, that can also become a kind of toxic exposure. Do you mind sharing more of your insights about this?
Yeah, no, I thank you for, bringing that up. I mean, that's one of the other parts. And so we talk within kind of this lifestyle psychiatry commission of the importance of trying to eat a whole food, get as much of the nutrition from plants or from the ground or, original source. And in extreme heat conditions, we know that the nutrition value of plants decreases. And so what's supposed to be this healthy food, from that source, then that becomes more affected. And also, if the food is grown in heavy polluted areas, it also affects the food content of that. So kind of historically, following World War II, just because of the impact of war that came across the entire world, there was this concern that they needed to develop calorie-rich food that would be able to feed a large amount of people who were in semi-poverty conditions. And, that was really kind of the start of what became processed food, was really kind of an answer to what was going back following World War II. And it seems like with each subsequent decade, there has then been more of a design of like, can we just artificially process the food to generate food, flavors, tastes, and kind of step away more from the original plant source or the original food source. We know that the ultra processed foods, we do not get the fibers. We do not get the whole nutritional content that you would get the same as eating from more of the whole food. We also know that when you start adding all of the extra sugars and absorbatives and stuff like that, that it can really trigger much of the same addiction reward pathway that we see within a lot of the substances. And, there's been some authors that have even suggested, where, many times we feel like cannabis is like the gateway drug to substance use. But, due to how ultra processed foods really tie into kind of some of the opioid mu receptors within the brain, that perhaps the original priming of the brain might be more from this introduction of ultra processed foods to our kids and teenagers, and that might be more of a significant precursor to substance use than cannabis.
So we're seeing not only the primary effects of extreme heat and disasters on folks' mental and physical health, we're seeing the secondary effects from that further trickling down into decreasing the nutritional value of our food and how important that is for both our mental and physical health.
Right.
Very interesting. And I think that could potentially also be part of the same sort of cycle of sorts as it relates to data demonstrating how a plant-based diet can be more effective in helping to mitigate climate change.
It can. And you look at the amount of how much energy it requires to process food versus how much energy is involved to be able to grow your food. And again, the numbers and the air pollution and the water use is quite significant. Of the extremes, more of the more you process the food, how it kind of takes away from, you lose value, you lose benefits.
That makes total sense. I mean, it's hard to get more efficient than photosynthesis, really, at the end of the day. And as we sort of talk about these intertwined webs and cycles, you were mentioning how this increased heat can lead to increased water temperatures and more frequent and more intense hurricanes is just one example. We're really curious to learn how these increasing frequency and intensity of disasters can potentially contribute to folks developing things like PTSD, this being their inclusion criteria of sorts of that trauma, and indeed increasing the burden and incidence of things like PTSD in our patients and populations.
No, and AC, that's a great observation that you kind of like get the double whammy, because you get the increased rates of depression, anxiety, just from the increase. There's a correlation with increased heat. And then when these disasters start happening, especially when you have higher rates of displacement, losing of housing, being separated from your community, not being able to return back to your community, and having somewhat of a normal routine, that all of those are factors that make it a higher rate for developing more of the PTSD, trauma-related events. And so you're kind of seeing adverse primary and secondary routes of it worsening the mental health.
Well, we're talking about all these environmental factors that can affect our mental health, like pollution and everything. Casey and I were also chatting about how noise pollution doesn't get mentioned that often, but you actually brought it up in your paper, and I thought that was really interesting. What are your thoughts on that?
And again, the more urban of an environments you live in, the more that there is noise. We know that the higher amounts of noise can also contribute to depression, anxiety, and such. We also notice that people sleep better without noise. And I know that there's a lot of push, well, they like white noise, and I guess that's fine. But most people don't do well with all of the ambient traffic noise, with all of that noise that people experience, the loudness, the televisions, the radios, that constant, that our brains actually do need quiet time. And I think that's really one of those pushes of why having kind of like increasing nature time, or increasing more green time or blue exposures in our lives can be such valuable parts to our mental health, is because we're disconnecting from all of that technology and all of that noise.
That's very interesting. And it reminds me, going through my work in the public health side of things, environmental health sciences, and learning about all of the potential impacts of noise, including how it can increase risk for things like cardiovascular issues, as well as mental health issues. It's just fascinating to sort of learn about all the ways that noise can affect us, as well as, kind of our underlying connected theme here, how all of these sources of noise may be connected to our climate crisis in terms of heavy industry and traffic. So it's multiplicative effects, really.
Right. And I mean, I think that's where, kind of going back to this new push within lifestyle psychiatry of, we have 6 pillars, and so the pillars are One is to have increased movement. Number 2 is to eat healthier. Number 3 is to have restorative sleep. Number 4 is to stress less. Number 5 is to have increased connectedness. And number 6 is, really, it was the avoidance of risky exposures or risky substances. But when you look at really what is that core of health, we really felt it needed to be expanded to include all of this toxic exposures, the substances that are easy to kind of include why. But when you also then start talking about heat and air pollution, and we didn't talk about extreme cold, but you can also make an argument of extreme cold can be very toxic for people. And we start looking at the noise, and you start looking at all of the microplastics, and you start looking at these various things that many people don't have the opportunity to. We talked about that are just based upon where you live, you're going to have a higher exposure to. And those social determinants of health, we know that so many of those populations of people, they have a shorter lifespan, and they have more mental health challenges, and they have more physical health challenges, and all of these. It does become intertwined, and many times the people who have the least impact are the ones who are most greatest affected. We see that here in the United States, and if we start looking, broadly across the entire world, we definitely see that those patterns across the entire world as well.
It's a very interesting point, and I appreciate you highlighting that in terms of, connecting back to one of our initial points when it comes to the avoidance of risky exposures. Many of these people have no opportunity really to avoid these exposures. And we really appreciate you laying out those pillars that you mentioned. Unfortunately, I think it's easy to connect some ways that our changing climate can sort of degrade those pillars. For example, talking about increasing movement and exercise. If we're having excess prolonged heat exposures, when it comes to exercising outside, it sort of, unfortunately, limits the opportunities to do that in a safe and healthy fashion.
Absolutely. And all of it just kind of builds upon it. And, and so again, we could kind of rehash a lot of the same type of things, but but you're right. And again, I appreciate both of you for giving me this opportunity to kind of discuss why with lifestyle psychiatry movement, we've really tried to expand from just substance use to kind of think about more of this as all of these toxic exposures, and why it's important for the APA, for psychiatrists, for the medical community in large to be able to start advocating for people. Because, I teach a climate health psychiatry lecture at my institution, and they looked at, based upon people's voting records, or, if they tend to lean more left or right, who they trust more with regards to the climate. And for the ultra conservative states, guess who's number 2 on that list?
I'm hoping physicians.
It is.
All right.
It is. And overall, we rank like number 5 across the board. And so if we as physicians aren't open to discussing science and discussing facts, and even if the facts may not be widely accepted, we still, as physicians, have that duty to advocate and trying to, advocate for these social changes.
I just think it's kind of wild how connected everything is, and how often we overlook things that are right in front of us. Even something as basic as sleep can be affected by so many factors all at once, like heat, air quality, and so much more. It really is all connected. So I'm wondering, is there any lifestyle approach or strategy you would recommend to help us navigate all of this?
I don't know that there's just one principle. I think, it was interesting. It was in the state of Ohio that, they had a number of the droughts, and one of the affected groups that was most impacted by that were the skiers. And the ski industry was like, hey, wait a second, we're not able to ski anymore or enjoy our ski season because we've been in this drought environment. And if we are able to talk about impacts like that, all of us got a sudden, the ski industry became a lot more supportive of trying to help suggest about the impacts of heat. And I don't think that we have to have this blue versus red battle on these things, because I think if we find topics we're all going to agree upon impacts that we've been affected by. If you live in Los Angeles, it really doesn't matter what your political ideations were. The amount of burn, what had happened with those fires is so significant. I mean, to kind of give in context, basically the geographic size of San Francisco was burned within that Los Angeles County area. Everybody in Los Angeles is going to be affected by it. So we have now a common vocabulary that we can use to then start talking about commonality. And so instead of trying to focus on extremes, I hope we can just come back as finding these common experiences that affect everybody. And that can be the driving factor of helping us do not only personal changes, but community changes.
Really appreciate that framing in terms of meeting people where they're at. Ultimately, this is a skill that is fundamental to medicine in general, in particular addiction medicine and psychiatry, in terms of meeting your patients where they're at, figuring out what's important to them, what motivates them, and trying to leverage that into helping them meet their goals for their lives and their health. And I think many of those same principles, like you're saying, can be translated to advocacy work. I'm curious as to whether there's any way to distill this down into a one-on-one patient encounter. In terms of anticipatory guidance you could give a patient in an encounter, I imagine much of this, as we're saying, is going to be very patient-specific. But if there's anything that comes to mind in terms of a particularly high-yield clinical pearl that we might be able to share with our audience.
When we start looking kind of like within the lifestyle the model, the number one thing that I feel that brings the most amount of significant change first is trying to help people improve their sleep. Because, if one is starting to sleep better, one has better cognition, one has better, one is less impulsive, and people then can start some of these other, these other type of lifestyle changes. And it becomes then of like, what are some of the contributing factors of why people don't sleep? Well, frequently we talk about, one's routine before they go to sleep. Are they watching television, noise? Are they having excessive caffeine, substances? Are they, arguing, improve connectedness? That I think that's really kind of a great place to start, because you can see, we were talking about how many of these pillars, they really interact with kind of all the other pillars. And I really think sleep is a really good foundational piece to start with.
That makes a lot of sense, and something that people very much tend to care about and are very much wanting to improve for themselves. And perhaps this is a way for clinicians to think a little outside of the box when it comes to typical sleep hygiene strategies and consider the environment in which their patients live in.
Right. And we talked about that chronic housing insufficiency, right? How well do people sleep if it's extremely cold or if it's extremely hot on the streets? They don't. And how many times do people use substances to stay awake because they're afraid that they don't want to meet the wrong people? I mean, it's really a great pillar to start off with. And, kind of what you're mentioning again, Casey, because so many people want to have good sleep. It's just a very fertile common ground to have a good conversation about.
Dr. Sugden, thank you so much for your time and for all of your wonderful insights. Is there any last thought you would like to share with us?
No, I appreciate both of your interest in this for the conversation that we've had. I think that this part of disasters, climate, lifestyle, I think really is an exciting part to be in as a psychiatrist, I'm more of an age psychiatrist. Most of you guys are more in your soon-to-be conquering the world psychiatry. And, I really appreciate your excitement to be in this field. And I look forward to the great work that both of you guys will do in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sugden. We really appreciate your time and for sharing all these words of wisdom with us and our audience.
To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on another conversation on the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the work of the Climate Psychiatry Alliance, please consider subscribing or donating to climatepsychiatry.org. Let's work together to build a healthier planet and a healthier mind. Take care.